What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some general thoughts or opinions about a potential remake or remaster for Oblivion, which has honestly been receiving such rumors forever, but have recently reached a sort of fever pitch as more and more leaks and stuff are mounting that point to it being quite possibly real. Now, generally speaking, I don't comment on things like leaks or make any content about them, and that's kind of why I'm doing the video this way. I'm just going to talk about the things I would want from that if it were true, or, a thing that was actually happening. And another part of that is simply that Oblivion's an important game to me. I reviewed it early last year and talked about a lot of the reasons why, but it's one of my favorite games. So the idea of it being, I would say, changed or updated in some way is certainly something I have opinions about. Quite a few, some of them are obvious, as they are largely things most people who play that game even these days things. Others are a touch more specific. But I want to kick this video off by the thing that is inevitably going to be brought up because Skyblivion, a mod for Skyrim that is introducing all of Oblivion's content, is set to release in 2025 as well. But frankly, I don't think it's a competition for starters because Bethesda is the reason that stuff like that is able to get made at all, frankly. Because say what you will about Bethesda, but pretty much nobody supports modders the way they do. In fact, I would say Larian recently is the only company that really comes close to that level of support. So simply for that reason, I think it's odd to try to pit them against each other. But more importantly, I also think that they're honestly just two different audiences altogether, which I think I talked about recently in my predictions video. But by way of simple explanation, however big a modding community is, it is simply a small fraction of any game's larger player base. Take the easiest example in that situation being Skyrim. Its modding community is gigantic, and even then, it pales in comparison to the number of actual Skyrim players. Now, watching this video even, though, the audience is probably a little skewed to think the opposite, and that's because if you are watching secondary media about something like this video, chances are you're probably a little more involved in that community than your average person anyway. Mods are great, I'm glad they exist, I'm glad they get actual support from companies, but also, the majority of players simply are not using them. So the number of people that would be willing to play a version of Oblivion through a mod is already a simply smaller audience than a full remake or remaster of a game would be. But more importantly, Oblivion in the form of Skyblivion is still Skyrim, really. Like, it's a mod for Skyrim. It's going to be using a lot of Skyrim's systems. And while I love Oblivion's content, and there's a lot of great stuff in there that I hope people get to experience, and the passion behind a team being able to take on a project that large and actually see it to release is crazy. But that game also just won't actually be Oblivion, which, to be fair, is not an entirely dissimilar situation from what a remake of Oblivion could potentially be, but we'll get to that in a moment. But in that case, see point one. It's a different audience. And one way or another, I'm pretty sure there'll be vastly different experiences. So I think they will coexist perfectly fine. To take that a little bit farther, let's then talk about a remake versus a remaster. Kind of gets intermingled sometimes, but fundamentally they are different things. So in this case, a remaster would be a look at Oblivion that kept fundamentally its core systems while obviously making it look better and maybe refining some of them, but the core experience would still theoretically be pretty close to what the original release was. Now that's different from a remake where everything would be rebuilt from the ground up, and this would potentially give you the option of seeing core systems overhauled. Now if this was something that was actually going to happen, I personally would prefer a remake. This is mostly because, as near and dear as Oblivion is to me, a lot of its systems are fundamentally broken, and we'll get into that again here in a moment. But I really don't see much of a reason to remaster specifically Oblivion. I just don't see what the benefit of that would really be. Outside of maybe just, fixing some general technical stuff, but, most people are capable of doing that on their own, and going farther and changing more stuff with mods if they even wanted to. Point being, in this conversation, I think a remaster has less to offer than a remake. See, a remake has the opportunity to change some of those flawed systems and replace them with more interesting ones, while potentially remaking at the same time the core of what makes Oblivion what it is, like its Radiant AI systems potentially. But even then, the second you start messing with that stuff, it's curious, at least to me, to see how much of that would actually survive in terms of what the core Oblivion experience really is, which tends to be the culmination of all these janky systems, kind of miraculously at times, kind of working out. But let's talk about some of that stuff that I think would be changed in any potential remake. First and most obvious one, progression systems. It is a very well-known fact that Oblivion's progression systems are busted, and this is primarily due to the way it handles things like level scaling in addition to the systems themselves. Both of which are some of Bethesda's, I would say, weakest work, stuff they went on to correct in later entries even. They get level scaling in a much better place in things like Skyrim, Fallout 4, even Starfield, actually. And while I don't necessarily love the place they've taken their progression systems, I actually think Starfield is probably the most interesting overall of their games past Oblivion in terms of actual core progression mechanics. But even stuff before Oblivion worked a little better because it didn't combine them into the specific combination that Oblivion does, which is bad level scaling on top of a system that is also kind of flawed. A system that Morrowind largely shares with Oblivion but doesn't come under the same scrutiny for because it lacks the level scaling. So I think any potential remake or honestly even a remaster would need to address that if they really wanted to pick up any steam. So the question then would be, what to replace them with. And honestly, there are a lot of approaches to this over the years, from just maxing out stat bonuses on your own, because if you're unaware, the main problem with progression is that basically depending on how you build your character, it can become impossible to actually get the max bonuses towards the play style that you are trying to set yourself up for. To give the simplest possible explanation, for instance, if you were to pick a warrior class just from the pre-generated list, you've actually made it impossible to get the max bonuses to stats a warrior needs, which is silly, to be honest. But I think the most interesting thing about a potential remake to me is seeing how they would redo that given a second chance, But the other side of that is also the level scaling. In Oblivion, it's not particularly well done. There are enemies that will scale with you infinitely, even past the point at which your damage plateau has happened, meaning that you're not really capable of dealing any more damage, but the enemies continue to grow in health with you, turning them into these giant tanks. Later entries of Bethesda's work, as I've already mentioned, have addressed this. And I'd be surprised if they didn't just, pull one of those similar systems there and put it into any potential remake. Fallout 4 uses like a system that breaks the map down into zones, each with its own level range, and that the first time you enter one of those zones as a certain level, it will lock the level of creatures in that zone based on the level you were when you entered it, meaning that there will come a point where you simply surpass those creatures. But then to keep things a little interesting, there are enemies that scale with you pretty much forever. And even implementing something like that would fix a lot of what the main issues are with Oblivion as an older game for sure. And then there's stuff like the combat. Obviously, when you go as far back as Oblivion and even Morrowind, combat isn't exactly what those games are known for. A whole host of crazy effects that interact with combat and things in fun ways, sure, absolutely. But the actual, feedback of using a weapon and getting hit and hitting enemies and stuff, it's not very impactful at all. In fact, sometimes it kind of feels like you're just shaking a wet noodle at the enemy, even if they're taking huge damage from it. So that would certainly be a place a remake could have a huge impact on what that game is in terms of the weight and feel of it all, especially in a game like Oblivion where, you're being invaded by what is tantamount to hell. Adding some real weight to that combat system and making it feel much more visceral, I think would go a long, long way, especially with the visuals that were already great even back then, but are certainly aged by now. Seeing something like an Oblivion gate shoot up and, the jaws of hell opening up in front of you only to then have to fight off the Daedra has all the potential to be this really epic experience. And if they nail the combat of something like that and really make you feel it, you could definitely do that. But then I think the hardest part any remake of the game would really have to contend with is the Radiant AI system, because say what you will about Oblivion, but a lot of its odd interactions with NPCs behaving strangely based on behavior metrics that were given to them by this Radiant AI system is a big part of what makes that game what it is. And that's to say nothing of things like schedules and stuff. And while I have absolutely no doubt that modern technology could in fact replicate and expand those things, we've certainly seen it in other games since then. What I am curious about is whether they could do that but also retain the feeling of it being Oblivion, because that's a much more amorphous concept that's hard to put into words, even for somebody like myself. In fact, the fact that it made NPCs sometimes react unpredictably to things is what made it so memorable. And that really leans into something like why, in my opinion at least, the Shivering Isles DLC works so well. because they took an area of the Elder Scrolls universe where all of the residents are in fact inflicted by some sort of madness, and then cranked this Radiant AI system up all the way to 11, which already made NPCs behave erratically, and it just came together to make this like really wonderfully memorable DLC where all of the parts coalesced into something special. And while that's great when it happens, it's a hard thing to recreate, as any amount of reviewing or really much of playing video games would likely tell you. It's not as easy as just snapping your fingers and making it happen, as much as we all wish that was the case. And I really do think it would probably be the biggest challenge any remake of this game would have. But then there's simply more ambitious stuff. Another thing about Oblivion is that, especially when it comes to the scale of its cities, you really feel the age of that game when you play it these days, because the Imperial City is supposed to be a gigantic city, and really it's a small district with a couple dozen NPCs. It really doesn't hold up to especially modern crowd tech that can make everything feel much larger. And it's easy, I think, to say, oh, you could just make those cities bigger because of new tech, but where does that end? Because making that stuff bigger also affects, of course, the size of the world and stuff, but completely disregarding that, if you have a much bigger and denser city, you then have to kind of fill it with content or interesting things to see, and that stuff is inherently not going to be Oblivion, now is it? Because as much as I think, bigger and more interesting cities might be the case, if I have to wade through 3 times as many houses to get to the NPC with the quest I know is there, I don't really think that's much of a compelling change either. So, where does that end? Do you make the bigger city and then fill it with content that isn't original? Is that fine because it's a remake? How much work and effort goes into that? There's a lot of questions there that I don't think there's easy answers to. And, whether I like those things or not is an entirely different conversation, because then the developers have to, dedicate the time and money to make those things a reality. And then because I don't know them, because they're not Oblivion, I couldn't tell you whether they're good or not. Do they feel natural to the game? I have no idea until it's in my hands. And so that's really hard stuff to have an opinion about, because one thing I love about Oblivion is that it has so many fantastic side quests. And I don't know that I would enjoy the sort of cadence and pace of that being interrupted by both changes to the actual landscape, but then even farther, adding content that might not feel as fun or as natural to the experience as it did back then. And when you put all of that together, you've kind of got my thoughts on any potential remake or remaster here. So to start wrapping this up, for starters, Sky Oblivion set to release in 2025. You will get a video of that out of me for sure. I love Oblivion. I want to see what that team has done, and I want to share it with people. It will not be a review. I do not review mods. That is not happening. But I do love Oblivion. That team clearly has a lot of passion, and I want to see what happened there, basically. What that project looks like across the finishing line is of great interest to me. But it should then go without saying probably that any sort of remake or remaster of Oblivion that ever happens, I will absolutely cover, because honestly, I think it would just be really fascinating to see what they changed, try to pick their brains about why they changed it, what the thought process and logic that goes into any bit of that. I would have a million questions, is what I'm trying to say. So, maybe. We'll see what happens. But for now, I think that's pretty much everything I've got to say on this one. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of that. Sometimes I just like to ramble about games, and that's really all this video was. But by all means, let me know what you think about it down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.